whole project to conserve the shroud, so to put it in inert gas, in a flat, and so on and so on. So they removed the patches, and in order to have just the shroud and no strange linen attached to it. So that is the first thing. You will notice that it was folded, and you had a big fold here, and another big fold here, you see, and then it was folded here and there. So the same image is copied deeper or less deep according to whether it was outside or inside of the fold. Now, apart from these big triangles, the next thing you notice is the watermarks. The watermarks are these marks here, like a rhombus. You have this. No, not that one. Here, typically, this is a mark here, and you have it copied again on the other side. These marks here, and marks here, and marks there, and so on and so on. This is due to the water that was thrown on the shroud in 1532. It had been folded in 48 layers, and you can see the horse going through the layers, and the watermark also going through the layers. However, you notice that you have a few other things that don't multiply at the same rhythm. And you have holes here, 1, 2, 3, 4. You have them again here, 1, 2, 3, 4. Again here, 1, 2, 3, 4. And again here, 1, 2, 3, 4. But you don't find them here, you don't find them on the other side of this fold. You don't find them on the other side of that fold. Can you see that? See? So they don't fit the same fold. They fit another fold of the shroud. And they were older than the fire of 1532 because you can find them in images of the shroud that predates 1532. They were marked on it, as you can see, a little bit after. So these were 4 holes. They have different interpretation for this. One of them is that there was someone who was very generously incensing the shroud, and some coals, burning coals, fell on the shroud and just actually made a hole on the shroud. And you have to also have the figure of with the ferryball. If the ferryball falls on the carpet, it makes a hole in the carpet. That happened to one of you a few months ago. You see here, no, I can't see here. Anyway. So that is what happened to the shroud. That is a suggestion. It's not proven that it is reliable to use. You have another thing that is very important to notice, and that is here, you see this rectangle here and rectangle there. Now, in fact, this is an absence of cloth. In other words, the original cloth is this one, and here you have a seam all the way through. Can you see that? All the way through. And that little cloth at the bottom is added to the rest of the shroud. This shroud is one piece, and you have another piece here that is added to it, sewn to it, and it's basically the same kind of tissue, same kind of cloth. So you might say, why to add a piece here? The first thing to notice is that that piece, when you add it, it makes the central picture here is exactly in the middle of the shroud. Without the piece, the picture is not in the middle. The piece is shorter than the shroud, is added after. What happened? So the interpretation is that when our Lord was buried in the shroud, they did not take precise care to have the body put exactly in the middle of the cloth, and it was put slightly off. But when they discovered there was a picture on the shroud, when they wanted to fold the shroud in such a way that the picture would be in the center, it was off center. So in order to be able to have the picture straight in the center, they added the piece, and it did not matter if it was shorter, because the shroud was folded in such a way that this image would appear on the front. So that is the interpretation. So the fact is there is a piece, and that is the only interpretation that gives a satisfactory answer to that piece. But it is interesting to notice there is an additional piece here. All right. Once you have seen this extra thing, we look at the picture itself. The first thing we notice are the wounds, like the wounds in the wrist here, the wound on the arm here, the big wound here for the heart. When I saw the shroud the first time, the most remarkable wounds were those of the back, or the scourging on the back. This is very visible when you stand far enough from the shroud. So you have wounds in there, marks of whipping, and you have wounds on the front here, which keep the tongue closed, the wound on the back of the head here, the wound on the heart, the wound of the arms and the hands, and then you have a wound in the feet here. That's the bottom of the feet, and that's the top of the foot here on the other side. And you got blood that fell on the side. So this is the bottom of the foot, and this is the top of the foot. So the wounds, the scourging in the back, the nails in the hands, the top and the bottom of the legs here. And the wound of the heart, the thorns, these are blood wounds. We'll come back later on that matter. You can see other things than the wound. You can see a certain on the cheek here, the blow on the cheek. This is on the cheek here. You have the nose here. It's easier to see on the negative, but you have on one side a big hematome that you don't have on the other side. You see here, not in the other. If you look at the back, negative here, and you see a big hematome here that you don't have on the other side. Can you see that here? This mark here, this mark on the other side. Can you see that? So that refers to the big blow that the Gospel mentions of the servant of the high priest when Lord had answered the high priest about his disciples. The high priest asked him, where are your disciples and what is your doctrine? And our Lord says, he does not answer about the disciples, he does not criticize them, they have gone away, but he does not say. But he answered about his doctrine. I have preached publicly in the temple where everybody could hear me. So if you want to know what I said, go and ask those who were in the temple at the time. Some of these priests were there and they were listening to me. They can testify that I haven't said anything that was against the law. But the servant did not like it. He gave a big blow to our Lord. And our Lord answered the servant, if I spoke badly, show what was bad. If I spoke well, why did you hit me? But it was a big blow that was mentioned, big enough to be mentioned in the Gospel, and which you can see here on the back of the negative. You can also see on the knees, on the front, the knees here, when you look at the wounds on the knee more carefully, there was a fall. You can see that a little bit. It indicates a certain fall, and they did find some gravel that would have been attached to the skin of the head. You can see coming back to the shoulder wound is very visible on the back. You can see the difference between the two sides. Here is much harder than on that side. One side here, you can see that, is much more wounded than the other side, you see? Can you see the difference? Okay, so that corresponds to the weight of the cross, you see? That was on the shoulder, you see, shoulder wound. Okay. The nose also is not very straight, some doctor says it's a little bit off. The cartilage, the bone was, there's no bone here, there's a cartilage, but the cartilage was, twisted, a little bit. That's, if you look at the nose here, the line here is not straight, the end of the point is not on line. It's not very visible with the naked eye, but if you have a straight line from the nose, okay, the point of the nose is a little bit off. So, now, after these wounds, what you notice is that there is something of another image, what is called the body image. Now, when the scientists of the Shroud of Turin project, research project, analyzed it, they found the wounds are real blood. You have the chemicals that you would expect in human blood. But the body image, like the fingers, you see the image of the fingers here, there is no blood. It is superficial oxidation of the fiber. That's what they find. That the image comes from the difference of superficial oxidation of the fiber, and it's a completely different nature of the other marks. The blood marks are blood marks. There is something on top of the linen. The other one, there is nothing on top of the linen. So, there is what you find out all these things. Okay. The body image, you have the image of the face, quite easy to see, the arms, the legs, and the whole body. I think it's important to also notice what we cannot see. In other words, there are certain things missing there. Here you have an image, and there is no paintbrush. There's no mark of painting, you see. Whenever you have a painter that paints something, a portrait, you would have the strand. He took his brush that way, or round, or he just stroked it, There is no mark of paintbrush at all. And they analyze the shroud on the microscope. So anything that even marks that you will not see at the naked eye, good painters that don't paint big, thick paint marks, and yet, you will be able to find it with a microscope. You can't see a thing there. No paint brushes, no added material on it, and even chemical analysis show that the body image is not made with any added material. You don't have pigments. The normal pigments that they use, not only in the Middle Ages but even before, you don't find any pigments on the shroud. How can you have a painter who paints without pigments? Painters always put something on the cloth of the paper that they paint. And so no pigment, no paintbrush marks. You don't find any corruption. In other words, there is no, when the body gets old, sometimes you have holes, you see, in the flesh because of corruption. You see. There's no such mark there, no corruption at all. Okay. And also the cloth is not torn. Now, that's something that's quite important because evidently there was someone in the cloth that was heavily wounded. Now, how can you remove a heavily wounded dead body from a cloth that has adhered to that dead body because of the blood that is on the cloth without tearing the cloth? If you have someone, if you fall, if you have a big wound in your arm and you put bandage, try to take the bandage off without tearing something. It's not easy. If you have to dress a wound, when the nurse takes off the old dressing, you feel it. There is some kind of tearing either of your own skin or of the cloth, but it's very difficult to take it away without tearing anything. Here there is no tear. The marks are clean, with no tearing whatsoever, neither of the cloth nor of the cloth. So you don't find it. So it is noticeable the fact that you don't find these things. Now, the last question is, what is that man? Is there a man whose wounds fit what we see on the cloth? Now, in the history, there is other things that are remarkable. First of all, that man was crucified, they have wound in the hand and the feet. He carried the cross. And he's buried in a rich cloth. Now, crucifixion was the punishment for slaves, not for rich people. So, if a slave was crucified, he was thrown in a common pit, and he was forgotten. He would not be buried in a nice cloth. If a rich man was crucified, there's not very many of them. Usually, the Romans and so that's the first thing to notice. In the history, there is no record of any man who was at the same time crucified and crowned with thorns, you see, and whose heart was pierced. You don't have normally, in order at the end of the crucifixion to get rid of the bodies, they would cut the leg, which they did for the other two without law. But they did not cut his legs. So they opened his heart instead. All these things make that image quite unique. There is only one person who fits everything in the image, and that is Christ, and nobody has ever found in the history any other one who fits that image. So it's not 100% proof, but the likelihood is pretty good, pretty bad. After the visual analysis of the image, so we should look at the history. The history of the shroud is like a puzzle with missing pieces. We don't have the whole thread of history, but we do have pieces, and not just pieces that are continuous with the present. Before, we do have additional pieces. The first thing to notice is that the shroud is mentioned in the Gospel. Many people say, oh, the shroud is not mentioned. That's not true. And even St. Matthew, St. Mark, St. Luke, and St. John, they all mention the linens. St. Matthew, Mark, and Luke mention sindon, which is a big cloth like this one, basically. And they mention that our Lord was involved in it, it was rolled in it, so there was a rolling movement, that was done to put our Lord in that cloth. And so that's fits the shroud, the rolling of the shroud over it. And it was not a little thing. Some people say, oh, the word used by St. Matthew and Mark, it's just a little handkerchief. But that's not true. The same word is used by St. Mark twice, one chapter after the other. Chapter 15 of St. Mark, chapter 14 of St. Mark, he mentioned the fact that after our Lord was arrested in the garden, there was someone who was following him, and they arrested him, and he had only a sindon on his naked body. And they took the sindon and he ran away with nothing. Okay. And he did not have a simple handkerchief. He had a bed sheet, you see. A bed sheet, he was wrapped in his bed sheet and come out, he was perhaps going to sleep in it. And you could clothe yourself in a cloth like that, but not in a handkerchief. So they grabbed the cloth and then he ran away with nothing. But so it is not a small cloth. Sindon means something that is similar to that. And he was wrapped into it, and that was a cloth big enough to wrap the body, you see, and that fits quite well. So they do mention that. Moreover, St. Matthew mentioned that he bought a clean sindon. Now, you have women among you here. When you go shopping and you buy some bed sheets, do you buy dirty bed sheets? You don't. Not even a single shop would dare to sell you dirty bed sheets. So, why would St. Matthew add the word clean? Moreover, if you know St. Matthew's Gospel, St. Matthew tends to shorten, to summarize. He's quite, he will tell in a few words what other Gospels tell in many more words. So there is no spare word in St. Matthew. So the very fact he mentioned it was a clean sindon when it was bought indicates that after it was probably not clean. It's a negative way to indicate that that sindon which they saw afterwards was clean before our Lord was put into it. You see? So the very word clean syndrome in St. Matthew is an indirect message to the Christian who knew the syndrome that the image that is in it is of our Lord. You see? So otherwise, there is no explanation for the word clean in St. Matthew's Gospel. So not only he was known, but it was known to be dirty after the resurrection, while it was clean before the burial. Now, St. John uses two other words. He used the word sudarion and dintiamina, that is in Latin. These were, he's more precise, St. John, and he himself recalled that when he arrived at Paris. So, and they both ran together, and that other disciple did Antoine Vita, Jean Alon, and came first to the sepulchre, and when he stood down, he saw the linen cloth lying, but yet he went not in. Then Thomas Simon Peter following him, and when he knew the sepulchre, and saw the linen cloth, mentioned second time, lying, and the napkin that had been around his head, not with the linen cloth, but a part wrapped into one place. And then that other disciple went in, who came first to the sepulchre. He saw and he believed. Now, he does not say what he saw. He saw and he believed. But if he saw that picture, then it makes sense that he believed the resurrection. You see? It makes sense. He does not say what he saw. He just said that he saw. Not just the fact that they were wrapped up and properly wrapped up, but he saw and he believed, and if he saw that, it makes sense that he believed. So the point is, it is mentioned in the Gospel. It does not say this cloth was shown in the Gospel, but the syndrome in which our Lord was buried was mentioned before the burial and after the burial. It is mentioned it was clean before the burial, and after the Gospel, so the next pretty secure identification of the syndrome is in Edessa. There was an icon not made by human hands. And that icon not made by human hands was the model of many other icons. And there is a very interesting study of iconography done by Jan Wilson. And he compares the icons that are before that icon of Edessa and those that are after, and there is a change, a remarkable change in this. In ancient paintings, like in the catacombs, you find Christ as a young woman without beard, short hair without beard. But after that icon was known, then almost unanimously our Lord is painted with longer hair and with a beard and a double-pointed beard. So there is clearly a certain influence of that icon on the iconography that is noticeable. And that icon not made by human hands is a very fitting word for this one, because it is a surprising kind of icon, and yet they could not see any paintbrush, and there is no paintbrush. So it was called the icon not made by human hands. It is likely that it was folded in such a way that you only saw the head, the front, the face. Because so you only saw and because they did not understand that it had negative photographic properties, they interpreted the eyes as being big, because they took that one as if you look at the eyes in the original, you have this big round white, which is in fact the back of the eye. You see. But here they don't see it, and so they take it as if it is the front. And it makes that the icons can show big eyes, abnormally big eyes, because they did not understand positive, negative. the circle of the eye is not the actual eye itself, but it is the dark recess of the eye that is shows white on the negative on the origin. So and the blonde mark on the forehead, sometimes you find some hair, but it's not hair. But they're just orange. That looks like hair, you know. And so these icons, it is not a certitude, but it is likely that this image of Edessa was the Shroud. Now, the thing that is known is that that image was bought by the Emperor of Constantinople and moved to Constantinople later on in the 8th and 9th century, and they still have the text of the sermon of renowned preacher there at the time of the moving. And when it arrived in Constantinople, they found out and they knew that it was a burial cloth. And it was exposed in Constantinople. The knights on one of the crusades that passed through Constantinople, they said that the burial cloth of Christ was exposed and you could see the wounds of Christ on that burial cloth. So there is a testimony it is in the list of the treasures of the empress. There is a list of it. It is in the journal of a certain knight called Robert de Carry, a French knight, that was devout and was making his Station of the Cross every Friday in front of the Shroud, exposed in Constantinople. The translation sermon from Edessa to Constantinople is mentioned in history, and you have one manuscript and one ivory carving that show remarkable fitting relation with the Shroud. We have the prayer manuscript, which is here, dated 1192, and the position of the body with the hand crossed, like you have here, with the fact that you only see 4 fingers on the hand, you don't see the thumb. And under here, you only see 4 fingers. With the difference is that since the view is on the side and not from the top, the thumb that is below should be visible from the side. You see, from the top you can't see it, but from the side you should see the thumb. And you don't see the thumb on the side. You see. So there's something missing. That's abnormal. And you can notice the others do have a thumb. You see, this one has a thumb here, the others have a thumb, but this one doesn't have a thumb. So that is, the thumb of that one is missing because he's normally, because of the position here, but the thumb here should be visible on this side. Anyway. The other thing you see on the plain manuscript are the 4 dots here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Are there 1, 2, 3, 4 here? Now you see them on the Shroud. The 4 dots, the 4 burning, and they make exactly the same angle here on the side. Now that, you might say, what about the red crosses? The red crosses indicate blood marks coming from the cross. It's a symbolic kind of vote. It's not a natural picture, But you also notice the weaving of the cloth, which fits the weaving of the Shroud. You see this kind of weaving here, quite clearly. And so the same movement, the body is put on the cloth, and the cloth will be wrapped on top of the body afterwards. And then at the resurrection here, the body is not only there. The cloth is clean here, and the cloth is dirty here, with red marks. And there is another item from 1100. This is an ivory carving from 1100. And you can see the same kind of position of the hands, the same 4 fingers without thumb, and the same place of the body, and the cloth is here, ready to be closed on the top. Same kind of movement. The body was put on the left side of the shroud, and the right side was curved on top of it. You see? So you find out exactly that here. You see? So it's quite the painting, the carving or the painting refer to the same kind of environment and burial movement in the cloth. And these two this is from Byzance, that is Constantinople. 1100. Okay. And it is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Anybody can come and visit it if you want. We have the position in the tomb, the 4 fingers, the 4 horns, and the red crosses, all that match the crown, the shrine. Now, the next item is after also there was the sack of Constantinople in 13th of April 1204, and then the shroud disappears. But the Emperor of Constantinople writes to the Pope and complains for the stealing that the knights had done. And among the things that were stolen, he mentions the shrine. So the burial cloth of Christ is mentioned in history before in France, and is mentioned as being stolen from Constantinople in 1204. Now the Pope gave orders to the thieves to restitute what they had stolen, which they didn't do. But the order was given, and we knew that there was a cloth that was claimed to be the burial cloth of Christ that was in Constantinople before, in 1204, before it was stolen, you see. So you have pieces, as you can see, but missing elements in between. And then after that, it appears in Lire, 1349, about 150 years later, in the house of a certain man called Geoffroy de Charny. Lire is in Champagne, in France, in the south of Champagne, in France. And that man, he had a grandfather who was in the crusade in 1204. So, we don't know whether he was a thief, but anyway, whoever, if he was a thief, he was dead. And at that time, it was, because of the medium pressures on Constantinople, it was no longer secure to send any relic back in Constantinople, and there was no more pressure in a certain way to restitute the cloth, and they started to expose it. It was, and from that day we had the whole history and the documents of the move. It was given by Marguerite de Charny as a marriage gift, you know, to the Duke of Savoy, you know, and then it went from Lire to Savoy, and then Chambéry in Savoy, and then from Savoy, the Duke of Savoy is used to reside in Savoy, in the French part of it, and later on he resided in Turin, which is part of his duchy. And so he wanted to bring the relic from Chambéry to Turin. The move of the relic from Chambéry to Turin in 1578 was due to Saint Charles Borromeo. Saint Charles Borromeo had made a vow that if the pestilence in Milan was extinguished, he would make a pilgrimage on foot to the Shroud of Turin, to the Shroud of Chambéry at the time. It was in Chambéry. But he was quite sick himself, and the Duke of Savoy took the occasion to request the canon of Chambéry to bring the Shroud across the Alps, so that he would not have to cross the Alps, for that, you know, holy bishop and a sick bishop. So they brought the Shroud to Turin. Saint Charles Borromeo was able to venerate it in Turin, and then once it was in Turin, the Duke of Savoy said, "I'll keep it, it's mine." And he didn't send it back to Chambéry. They were not happy about it, but he said that. So that's how it came to Turin, 1578, which was 400 years before the exposition in 1978. The story there, when it was in Chambéry, that's when it was burned in 1532, when it was still in Chambéry, before it came to Turin. The part of the history, there was at the time of the first expositions when the descendant of Jean started to expose the shroud, there was opposition from the local bishop. And one of the reasons is because he would fear that there would be devotion going there and not to his own, the donation of the benefactors would be diverted away from his cathedral to that other shrine. And he opposed it. However, the popes at the time approved the devotion to the shroud. It was at the time of the Great Schism, so it was the Pope of Avignon who first approved it, but it was approved by the Pope. And the reason why it was approved was because the inspection of the shroud did not show any paint, any kind of flaw like that, so that it showed an icon not made by human hands, and therefore, they permitted the veneration of it. And it used to be quite frequently venerated. For instance, Saint Francis of Sales, in the early 17th century, he went to Turin and was part of one particular exposition, and it is said that he was really touched by the shroud and was weeping with big tears. And the cardinal, he was holding the shroud. There were a cardinal and 4 bishops holding the shroud. So the cardinal was in the center, and the Saint Charles was on Saint Francis of Sales was on the side, and he was weeping big tears, and the tears were falling on the shroud. And the cardinal said to him, "Hold yourself, my Lord Bishop, And he says, "My Lord and Jesus, stain this shroud with his own blood. I can put a few of my tears there." So, but it was oftentimes exposed up until the invasion by Napoleon. Napoleon invaded the north of Italy in around 1800. Anyway, and then they hid the shroud at that time because they didn't want the shroud to be stolen by the French. The French had never stolen it before. Once is enough. So they hid it, and then, but they knew where they hid it. And then, when Napoleon was out of the picture, they took it out again. But in the 19th century, there were not that many expositions. There were a few expositions, but not many. And at the end of the 19th century, that's on 28th of May 1898, there was a big exposition. The exposition was in order to visit the bishops of northern Italy. It was at the end of the 19th century. It was a very anti-clerical time. If you can read the life of Saint John Bosco, you can see how opposition there were between the Lombard government with Victor Emmanuel and the church. The Italian government took over Rome at the time, took away all the papal states from the Pope, and so there was a lot of fight against the church. And in an effort to restore the piety and the devotion of the people at the end of the century, they decided to make a big exposition of the shroud. And at that occasion, photography had become quite fashionable at the time. There was an amateur photographer, but quite a capable one, called Secondo Piatti. He was an attorney, a solicitor of his profession, and he loved photography. He asked permission to photograph the shroud. So he did it quite well, and that is not his own picture. It is a copy of the recent picture. The original picture was not as good as this one. But when he developed it, and he saw for the first time in history the negative of the shroud, he thought he had an apparition. he saw something that nobody had seen before him. He saw this picture, which when you compare it with that, this is strikingly more visible. When you look at the right side, it's much easier to understand what you see than when you look at the original. The very contrast between the negative and the positive is something striking, you see. You can see the picture, you can see the arms, but when you look at the negative, it's a normal picture. You see? In other words, on the positive, you have an inversion of light and dark, which was not understood until we get the photograph was taken. That's, in a certain way, at the end of the 19th century, photography was at the, let's say, the sharp edge of science. It was the latest technology, it achieved wonderful things, and lo and behold, in that time of skepticism, the latest science was giving a photograph of Christ. That sent shockwaves in the scientific community of the time. There was a French doctor called Paul Lesage, Yves Delage. Yves Delage was a skeptic, a medical doctor, and he used to laugh at all the paintings and the statues because he said the painters, he made a body that is, the arm is too long, the arm is too short, the head is too big. Always finding fault in the paintings or the carvings of the artist in holy pictures or holy statues. And he was a skeptic and a scorn, full of scorn for religion. But when he heard of that, he says, I'm going to go there and I'm going to measure it and I'm going to prove it beyond doubt it is a fake. He went to Turin, he asked permission to measure the negative of Secundopia, and the more he studied it, he says, this is amazing. There is no medical error in that painting, in that image, put it that way. And for him as a doctor, it was something unique, because it was easy for him to find medical errors in any other paintings. But he could not find any error in that one. So he came back and made a report, and the Academy of Science refused to publish his report. He said, hey, wait a minute, I'm a scientist as much as you are. Why do you refuse to publish my report? You can check it if you want, and they still do not hear it. And that helped him to become Catholic, to return to the faith, to return to the practice of the faith. And one of his pupils, called Paul Villon, was the first scientist who really studied in depth the Shroud. He proposed the first effort of giving an explanation of the Shroud, which was proven later on to be false, like all the others. But it was an interesting trial. He thought it was a chemical reaction between the sweat of the body and the aloes that had been put on top of it that would have caused the picture. It was proven to be false. But the point is, he studied it very seriously, and the picture was spread all around. The Cardinal of Lisieux, you know that Saint Therese of the Child Jesus died in September 1897, so basically 6 months or 8 months before the first picture. And she was already of Saint Therese of the Child Jesus and of the Holy Face. That was her second name, long of the Child Jesus and of the Holy Face. And she had a great devotion to the Holy Face of Jesus. And her sister said, later on, when they had a copy of the negative, she would have loved it. She would have loved it, that negative. And that's quite certain. She may have obtained the grace of the first picture when she arrived in Italy. So, another doctor that studied it is Dr. Barbet. Dr. Barbet in the 1930s, and he approached the Shroud as a medical document, and he analyzed the suffering of the man who was buried in the Shroud. And that's quite interesting. He wrote a book, La Passion selon la médecine. Okay. On the Passion of Christ, all based on his analysis of the Shroud. And he pointed out the two angles here that fit what he says. When our Lord was on the cross, sometimes in order to breathe, he would try to lift himself on the cross to be able to have a little bit, to breathe a little bit, and then the weight of the body would fall again. See? So, and that led two different angles here that you can see on the Shroud. These kind of things he studied, Dr. Barbet. Later on, another doctor, Dr. Tsugibe, in the late 80s, early 90s, studied again the Shroud on the medical side of it. And he is He's the kind of doctor that do post-mortem, that he analyzed the dead people and make a certificate of death and the cause of death. And so he specialized in finding the cause of death. He slightly disagrees with Dr. Barbier about the cause of death, but it's dispute of doctors. The interesting thing that they say is they point out that if you look on the front side, you can see it on the negative, you can't see the neck on the front. If you look at the back, the neck is extended. See that? Okay. So in other words, although he did not bend his head on the side as many painters. So the Gospel says he bowed his head and down. He didn't bend it on the side, he bent it forward. See, when there is no more strength, the head falls forward. And there is no neck on the front, and there is still the neck on the back. You see? But when you put the body in the tomb, the neck was not fallen. It remained in that position in the tomb. See? The body was like that with the head up and not fallen. Otherwise, you would have seen the neck at the front. So, if he was still like that, it's because of rigor mortis. The stiffness of death, after death, the body is stiff, until decomposition sets in, and because of decomposition, then it loosens, and the head will have fallen down. Decomposition happens about 3 days after. So, the body stayed less than 3 days in the tomb. And then other doctors studied that, and medicine is in a certain way the first science after photography that looked at the shroud. And a lot of other things mentioned is the very fact that there is no mark of tearing the cloth from the dead body, in a certain way can only be explained by the resurrection. Because the resurrection, the body is separate from the wound, and therefore there is no more separate. The body goes out without the wound. But without the resurrection, the wound will not hit the body, and you could not take the body 3 days later without tearing something. So, now, the next science is the stirp. 1978, 400th anniversary of the transfer of Turin from Savoy to Turin. This Shroud of Turin research project, 32 American researchers and 3 tons of equipment were brought to Turin to analyze the shroud. Many of them were non-Catholic, most of them, and many of them came with the idea it would be easy to prove it false. With our technology, we're going to find out the paint that was used, or the mistake that may have been done, whatever. It would be easy to be proven false. But when they arrived there, at the very start, they could not see with their eyes any paint. So they were so enthused about that, they had asked 5 days. Now 5 days is 120 hours. They wanted to use every single minute of this 120 hours. So they divided themselves in 3 groups, and 8 hours each group, and non-stop observation, days and night. Because they knew they had these 5 days and they wanted to have as much time as possible. So they took a lot of pictures, a lot of measurements, a lot of evidence, whatever they could find, and they analyzed these in the years after, and they published article after articles in the late 70s, early 80s on the Shroud of Turin. And those shrouds, each of them, those studies, each of them was adding one element in favor of the shroud. And it became so, you have some pictures here, they are working on their big telescope and everything. So it was studied by diverse sciences, spectroscopy, that is, the church has said you can't touch it. You can't damage it because it's unique, so we don't want you to damage it. But you can do it. But the scientists said, no, but it's like the moon, it's like the stars. We can't touch them, but then we can do a lot of studies on them. And the sciences that are used to study the stars or the moon has been applied to the shroud, and particularly spectroscopy. Spectroscopy is to analyze the chemicals by the spectrum that is emitted by it. You send a light on it, and you look at the light that is reflected, and you analyze the spectrum of that reflection, and it tells you a lot of information on what is in the chemicals on the cloth. So they use spectroscopy, analyzing the spectrum of the shroud, and all kinds of microscopic examinations. Some chemistry. The church had allowed to draw some fibers in the 1970s. There were a few fibers that were taken from non-important spots, and they were analyzed with chemistry. Biology, they looked at botany, and there was a scientist from Switzerland who was he was a specialist of pollens, and he was working for the police to prove whether or not someone had been in certain places by finding or not finding pollens that were specific of these places. If you go, for instance, here we're in New Zealand, but if you go and visit Australia, you might come back with the special pollens that are in Australia but not in New Zealand. And you can prove that you've been in Australia because your cloth have pollens from Australia, you see. So he applied that kind of technique in the shroud, and he found pollens that not only from France, Champagne and Savoy, but also from Asia Minor, like Edessa, Constantinople, and even from the Holy Land. And that's not something that is approved, but it's an element in favor of the shroud. You see, it corroborates the history of the shroud. Another technology that is three-dimensional analysis of the stars. How far are the stars? They use several techniques for that, but one thing is when the star is further, then the light faints through the distance. The further you are, the fainter it looks, you know. And the closer it is, the brighter it looks. So the brightness of a certain image, if it is proportionate to the distance, then you can, if you can establish a proportion between brightness and the distance, then you can get a certain three-dimensional view of what you're looking at. And they have applied those techniques to the body image, and they obtained some remarkable results, like this result, like a three-dimensional image of the head and of the hand. No photograph will ever do that. The reason is because of the shadow. See, when you have a shadow, the light comes from the lamp, you know, and then you have a line, the line that is shadowed and the line is not shadowed. And because so that which is brighter is not brighter because it is closer, but because it is in the light from the lamp. And that which is darker is not darker because it is further, but because it is in the shadow. So whenever you have photography and you have shadows, you can't have three-dimensional image. Get the idea? Does it make sense? Try to explain it. But the shroud does not have that, as you can see. There is no shadow here. See? There is a proportion between that which is, when that is closer is brighter, that which is further is darker. Or rather, the contrary. That which is closer is darker, that is bright and negative, and that which is farther is brighter, that is having less of an image on the shroud. Archaeology, some have tried to find some images on the coins on the eyes or other writing on the side. That's less of, I said, I'm not in those science, but the image is not very conclusive in my opinion. There may be, but they